All right. Dr. Kinwumi, thank you so much for joining us. We're very excited to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for the opportunity to be on the podcast.
You lead the National Fair Housing Alliance's Responsible AI Lab. And to start things off, can you tell us a bit about what this lab is, what you all do, and in particular, why the National Fair Housing Alliance decided that AI and automated systems would be a new frontier in civil rights housing work?
The National Fair Housing Alliance, being a civil rights organization, I understand why it's really important for us to clarify why being at the forefront of responsible use of AI in housing, it's a good civil rights fight to be fighting at this time. But before I answer your question, I just like to briefly let the audience know a little about the National Fair Housing Alliance. So we lead the fair housing movement, and NAFA is the nation's only national civil rights organization dedicated to eliminating all forms of housing discrimination and segregation, and also ensuring equitable housing opportunities for all people and communities. And as part of our commitment to eliminating all forms of segregation, we got to the point where we realized that AI, artificial intelligence, is being used at every stage of housing. In fact, when it comes to the history of redlining, we know some of these discriminatory policies were actually sanctioned by the government. And now, not surprisingly, even the government is also using AI. But I like to actually take you back to 2018 when the organization, that's the National Fair Housing Alliance, along with other civil rights organizations, sued then Facebook for allowing discriminatory housing hubs. And what we found out was that landlords, real estate brokers, they were able to use this platform driven by AI to exclude people based on factors like race, family status, and other protected classes. And that was when we realized that we need to look deeper under the hood of AI systems that are actually impacting housing. And even more recently, after 2018, the Department of Justice, they also sued Meta, right, on similar issues. And that is actually when we realize that AI is already impacting all the processes that are connected to housing. And as a reminder, when it comes to redlining, right, which is really a big issue in housing, led to the current state of segregation. It was sanctioned by the government, then a discriminatory policy. And we're also seeing as required under the White House executive order on the use of AI, we're beginning to see more agencies, including those that are connected to housing, using AI, right? And so, for example, we know the role that the federal government played in redlining. And now when you go on our agency website, you see that AI is being integrated into housing services, financial services, and other similar services. So that's why we decided that we need to actually be working on how AI can be used or should be used responsibly in housing. And as part of the work we do, I would like to say we focus on three things. So, one, we want to make sure that AI, whenever it is used in housing services, it considers the risks that come with AI. So, risk management is something that is very essential to what we do. And as part of risk management, when you think about AI system, there is writ large three different areas that risk can manifest in AI system: the data layer, the algorithm itself or the model, and then also the implementation of the policies that implement the recommendations from the system. So we're actively involved in mitigating risk. And the other pillar of what we do is innovation, right? So when it comes to, for example, the role that credit system plays in acting as a gatekeeper to having access to housing, we are always conducting research, trying to develop different prototypes to find a way where we can, for example, innovate credit decisioning, which is a core piece or core pillar of the use of AI in housing. And the third area that we focus on within the lab is what I call governance, right? So there are different principles, and hopefully the fifth time permits, I'll go into some of those principles, but a lot of principles that we believe that an AI system should emulate. And as part of our governance work, we want to make sure that the implementation of those principles are also consistent with existing laws, like existing civil rights laws, existing laws like Fair Housing Act, Equal Credit Opportunity Act, and similar laws.
Thank you so much. That was such a rich answer. And
Thank
I
you.
have a couple follow-up questions stemming from that. And maybe to start, I am really glad that you raised the example of the lawsuit against Facebook, because I think that's a very tangible example of the use of AI in the housing process. And like you said, there are so many different decision-making steps within the housing world, whether it's renting, whether it's home ownership. And I'm wondering if you can describe other examples. So the Facebook example seemed like one that's more upstream in terms of advertising. I'm wondering if you could walk us through maybe one or two other examples of the stages in the either, like, let's say someone is a prospective tenant or a prospective home buyer. What are other decision-making steps where that person might encounter the use of AI, whether they know it or not, but where AI might be informing the process of their access to a new home?
Yeah, that's really a good question. So, when it comes to housing or housing processes, so we can think of three areas. One is buying property, selling property, or renting property, right? And in each of those areas, we're beginning to see the use of AI in all those three areas. But to give you a concrete example, if we just focus on the process of buying a property, right? So it could start with, let's say, a prospective buyer trying to assess what their budget looks like, right? So you need to decide this is my budget. And after you decide your budget, you can also seek a pre-approver, right? And then that pre-approver traditionally relies on, simple algorithms or statistical machine learning models. Now that we have advent of alternative data that traditionally are not captured on credit reports, right? So we're beginning to see financial institutions that give this pre-approval using AI. So, and once you decide that you have your pre-approval in hand, right? Another stage here could be trying to find a real estate agent, right? So we're also seeing AI systems being used for lead generation, right? Which is the process that matches prospective home buyers with real estate agents that helps them or assist them to search for properties. Because like the searching for property itself could be we could think of using AI to influence, for example, what a prospective buyer is going to see, depending on where they are searching for the property, or even what the real estate agent is also going to see, depending on where they are searching for property. But the process of matching a prospective buyer with a prospective real estate agent, it's a process that requires different levels of AI system, for example, personalization, because for you to do true matchmaking, the agent needs to have some information, right, about the prospective buyer. And so for same thing for the prospective buyer as well. So that's one stage where AI systems can also be used. Another step in the process of buying a property is appraisal. So evaluating the value of the home. So home appraisal process. The type of AI systems being used there is AVMs, automated valuation models, right? So, based on prior work that we've done, we see that AVMs are not really as accurate in rural areas compared to urban areas, but we're beginning to see AI being used to uh, uh, determine or predict the value of a property. The other stage where, so you have the process where you have your pre-approval, offer is made and all that, right? So when it comes to pricing or setting the terms of the loan under mortgage underwriting, AI could also be used at that stage. So pricing systems it's another use case, right? So these are different examples of different stages of home buying process where AI systems are being used.
That's incredibly helpful. And the other follow-up question I had related to your kind of introduction about the priorities for the responsible AI lab and kind of situating within the context and history of housing discrimination, including practices like redlining. I think many people might think of AI as being a potential solution to discriminatory decision making because there might be this appearance of AI and algorithms as being neutral. Um, can you talk through, like, is this completely misguided and why are we concerned about these systems not being neutral and actually producing or exacerbating discrimination?
That's a good question. One of the things I always say is that when it comes to technology in general, but AI specifically, that they are not good, bad, or neutral. So it really depends on, for example, the management process that you have in place. It also depends on the governance process or compliance process that you have in place. And more so when it comes to AI, because it's being powered by data and then also by math, there may be there is misconception that, well, one, data is always objective. So it's factual, right? And we see instances where that's not the case. The quality of the data can impact on the accuracy of the system itself, the veracity of the data, and then also the variety of the data. These are all the different aspects of data quality that can determine what happens downstream in an AI system. Not only that, when it comes to the math itself, right? So math, we always think of math as like pure gospel. It's always true, right? But data, just like data is a representation or some representation of observation, same thing is math. It's just the math behind the AI system is just a representation of thoughts of those who are developing the systems. And the moment you start thinking about, how to solve the problem and what data you're using or what math or algorithms you're using, these are all the different ways where potential biases can actually come in and manifest in the system. So that's why it's really important not to think of AI system as a neutral system or as a system that is always objective. There are a lot of different governance frameworks that need to be in place to actually make sure that the use of AI in housing is safe, secure, and also trustworthy. That said, even though when it comes to like responsible use of AI, most of the conversation is around like focusing on the bias and all that, right? I could tell you based on what we see in housing, there are also instances where AI, for example, provide access for those who have been considered to be traditionally unscorable under traditional systems, or those who are considered to have thin credit files, right? With AI, using it responsibly, you can leverage alternative data that will be nearly impossible for some of the traditional scoring systems. And that's why I always say AI is not good, it's not bad, and it's not neutral. It really depends on the choice or choices and decisions that those who are developing the systems and using the systems make. And part of the choices here is really compliance with existing laws. Equal Credit Opportunity Act, for examples, has protected classes that you cannot use to discriminate when you have your systems. For example, the Fair Credit Reporting Act also calls for explanation in the advent of adverse action, right? So that's where adverse action notices are coming. So the responsible use for good really needs to comply with these existing laws.
Thank you. And I'd love to ask about maybe one example of the application of AI in housing that has produced discriminatory outcomes, particularly for Black potential sellers or renters or homeowners. And then maybe an example of one of these instances of including alternative data that has increased access and equity in housing. So maybe starting with the example of discrimination and like a time in which AI has been used that has run afoul of existing civil rights protections.
There are a lot of examples out there. In fact, there are databases that are tracking all these negative impact or outcomes when it comes to AI. But I'll use one example of bad outcomes, which is like tenant screening, and this is based on some of the cases that we're closely monitoring and that we're also involved in. And then example of good application here, I've talked about how AI can be used to, assess the true credit worthiness of those who have thin file, and then also those who are considered to be unscorable. But I would also have an example that is coming from a recent research that we completed with the Fair Play AI. So when it comes to tenant screening, right? So algorithms in tenant screening generally, at least based on activities coming from different states that are using AI algorithm to train tenant application. So they are shaping those who get access to an apartment or not, right? But what is really striking here is that the systems rely on low quality data. Not only that, they also rely on data that have disparate impacts on people of color, right? So, for example, when it comes to the data that they rely on, tenant screening algorithms, so they rely on credit scores, criminal records. They also rely on rental histories, and they also use some cash flow data, right? And when it comes to criminal records, right? So we know that Black people, they are 5 times more likely to get arrested compared to white people. And a single criminal record, right? It's something that can, depending on the case, can stay for a long time on your report. And now, when now that landlords and are using some of this data in their tenant screening processes, we're beginning to see how tenant screening algorithms put prospective tenants at a disadvantage, especially those who are people of color, right? And same thing when it comes to credit scores as well. So majority of the people that are considered to be thin, to have thin files, or people that are considered to be unscorable under existing systems, um, legacy scoring system, majority of those are Black Americans, they are people of color, right? And we actually, I mean, by we, the National Fair Housing Alliance qualifies the traditional credit scoring systems to be AI systems, right? And so that those are examples of cases where irresponsible use of AI in credit scoring, in tenant screening, had negative outcomes, right? Disproportionate outcomes, especially on people of color. Now, when it comes to a good use, right? So when it comes to the GSs, the government-sponsored enterprises, which are regulated by FHFA. So what we know is that they are adopting AI systems again, especially as even demanded or required by the White House Executive Order on AI. They are using it to see how they can debias the system. So we have mortgage, for example, concrete examples, mortgage underwriting AI systems and mortgage pricing AI systems that are based on AI. But then there are also a different types of AI techniques that you could use to make sure that the outcomes that come out of the system, that is the decisions to approve or deny, and then also depending on the loan terms, right, the pricing, they actually they are not creating disparate impact on people of color. So what the GSCs are using, they're using adversarial debiasing, which is an AI system or AI algorithm that corrects for disproportionate impact within the system. And for us at the National Fair Housing Alliance, recently we partnered with Fair Play AI, which is a fintech that is based out of LA, to look into how AI techniques can be used to remove bias from mortgage underwriting processes. And what the techniques actually does is that it helps to distribute the outcome across the protected classes that you're looking at in your mortgage underwriting system. So that's one way. And in addition to the examples that I shared, we have an active ongoing research that we hope to wrap up next month that is constantly looking at, we're testing 5 different techniques, and these are AI techniques for making sure that AI outcomes are not discriminatory. So to us, those instances or those examples are what we consider to be a good use of AI.
Thank you so much. Those
Yeah.
incredibly helpful, I think, to have those tangible examples of how AI can be used. Um, Another question we have is related to transparency and whether or not someone who is a prospective buyer or renter would have any knowledge of AI being used. So, how much about the AI, like if AI is used in a tenant screening, for example, would that be disclosed to a tenant? And would they have any insight into, if they were denied, for example, what information was used and resulted in the denial, or is it more of a black box in practice?
First, when it comes to transparency, it could just be as trivial as disclosure to, the prospective consumer, right? Or that, well, this is how we're using AI, and it is like what stage we're actually using AI. So earlier on, I talked about the different stages of involved in buying a property, right? But it could just be that AI system is being used in all those stages, or maybe it's just being used in one of those stages or at the end of the stages, right? So transparency could just be as being simple disclosure that for this decision, we're using AI. And really, majority of the issues that we see in AI use in housing and also lending borders around lack of transparency, right? Lack of disclosure. Even though we have existing laws at the federal level that requires disclosure, even in the case of like adverse decision, when you make adverse decision, you need to make some certain disclosure. At the state level, also, there are different states, for example, that have enacted laws that require disclosure, right? So, the state of Utah actually has a disclosure that is mandatory when generative AI is used to make a decision that impacts, right? So that's one aspect of transparency. The second aspect of transparency is what I'll call a contestability, which requires providing sufficient information for consumers to be able to contest the decision. For example, the tenant example that I mentioned that relies on credit score, criminal records, and all that, right? If the quality of the underlying data is in question, without disclosure, without transparency about this is the type of data that we're using, this is the source of the data we're using, then the consumer will not be able to actually make a proactive step of correcting the quality of the data. The same thing applies to the service provider. So if there's no disclosures for to the consumers, and the consumer does not have the opportunity to contest that decision, right? Then they are not going to have enough information to update the underlying data and make a redress. So contestability is another aspect of transparency that we consider. And the other aspect of transparency, which is also really important, that also guide the work we do, is explainability. I know traditionally, like explainability or being able to explain, for example, how the AI system arrives at a decision or a recommendation, or how the AI system is actually configured, right, is often separated from transparency. But because this is something that also covers the old AI system. So that's why we consider explainability to be under transparency. So there are existing laws right now in terms of like what needs to be disclosed, what needs to be explained. In fact, the CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, has also issued some circulars on how the existing laws apply to AI system when it comes to explainability. So as part of transparency, it is incumbent on service providers to not only explain the decisions of the system, and there are a lot of different techniques. Again, these are AI systems that you could use to actually explain the decision, but also explain how you arrive at what data points are actually impacting the decision. For example, as part of explainability, you don't want to include data that is not predictive of the scenario you're considering, right? So if we're talking about the risk of delinquency or being able to actually make your mortgage payments, right? You don't want to use the data that is not predictive of that particular case. So as part of transparency, it's really important that we consider explainability, providing reason codes, providing explanations to consumers, providing information that consumers can use to contest the decisions where necessary. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to many AI use cases in housing, tenants screening, for example, consumers, they don't have clear information about how stakeholders or where stakeholders are using algorithms. They don't have sufficient information about what data types are being used. They don't have sufficient information about how they're making these decisions or recommendations.
Thank you so much. I have another follow-up question related to that, which is maybe getting a little bit too into the weeds for our listeners, but I want to try to ask it in hopefully a way that makes sense. So I'm a researcher, and
Yeah.
often in public health research, we think of models as being potentially a causal model, where the variables that you're putting into the model, you have the theoretical mechanism for why X should cause a change in Y. And then on the other hand, you have predictive models, where I think of most AI tools as being strictly predictive, where you kind of just throw all of the information you have into the model, because any information could improve your ability to predict the outcome. And it sounds like, if I'm understanding you correctly, it sounds like this notion of explainability is maybe like calling that into question of maybe you shouldn't throw everything into the predictive model if you don't have a theoretical explanation for why this predictor would be informative of the outcome, whether it be like ability to pay mortgage payments or your likelihood of being a good tenant. Is that right? That you shouldn't, the idea is that you shouldn't put something into your algorithm if you can't explain why it would influence the outcome?
So when it comes to AI systems generally, or AI use in different use cases, including housing. So you're right, there are two approaches. One, you have causal models, right? And where you have this theory about how things work, about the mechanisms underlying the observations that you have. So, and that theory that you have is what you actually build into your graphical models or any other type of causal models you have. And I also want to say before I go to the second part that the fact that we call it causal models does not really mean that truly it's causative, right? Because again, it's a theory, a thinking that we're thinking, well, this is how things work. And in fact, that thinking and that theory could also be subjected to fallacy, to bias, and discrimination. So, but on one side, we have causal models, right? And what that means is that the good thing about that is that you don't wait to have the outcome before you are explainable, before you explain what is really going on. Okay. You don't need to have the observation that is coming out of the system before you actually explain the underlying mechanisms, for example, behind the mortgage payment, delinquency, and even decisions to approve or deny. On the other side is what we have correlation. Again, that's really the traditional attention, causality, and then also correlation. So the idea of correlation here, which is really predictiveness, right? So you throw everything into the system and you're just trying to see what correlates with the outcome or not, right? And there are instances where we've seen even in practice that, for example, if you're saying your phone area code is predictive of your likelihood to make your payment or not, right? That sounds really unreasonable that my phone area code will be able to tell you if I'm able to make payment or not. But that's where predictiveness and correlation actually comes in. And that's what explainability is asking for. You want to make sure that the attributes that you're using in the system is predictive of the risk that you're trying to quantify or qualify. Otherwise, you just have everything that you're not even able to like justify to the consumer.
Thank you. So it sounds like you mean, or you're saying not just statistically predictive, but it's predictive in a meaningful way.
Meaningful way. Exactly. Yeah.
That's incredibly helpful. I just have one final question. I think we've covered a lot, and this has been such a comprehensive conversation. The last question I want to ask is like from the perspective of someone who is going through the process of seeking a home, what are some of the actions that we should all take as individuals when we might be confronting the use of algorithms in our housing search process? Like, how can we be an informed and active participant in the use of AI in housing?
Yeah, that is a great question, but I would say that you're basing that question on the assumption that consumers or prospective home buyer or seller or even prospective tenants already know that AI system is being used, right? Because that's a really huge assumption. And that's really part of the fight we're having with industry stakeholders that you need to disclose to people, to disclose to consumers when, if, or how you're using AI systems, right? Because that's really the starting point. So, and I always say that one, the starting point here, which is really the step one, the first step is that consumers need to be informed. I think earlier on, I mentioned that AI is not good, bad, or neutral, right? And if you think, for example, attitude of most people on social media that, well, I really don't care if you have my data as long as you provide the services, right? Without really paying attention to nefarious way where algorithms may actually be deciding or controlling what they see or not. So the very first thing is that consumers, they need to be informed and they need to ask questions. So AI is not some mystical mystery object that they cannot ask questions about. It's as simple as one, who is making this decision? Is it a human that is making the decision? Or is this an automated process? Or is this semi-automated process? So that's really the first thing that consumers should be doing. And it's within their rights to stay informed and ask a question. And it's also important for them to document their experience. It's very, very important because again, in the event of adverse action, right? The adverse action notices that will be sent to consumers can actually avail much. But it's also important that if the experiences are documented, say you're trying to search for a real estate agent or you're searching for property and you have this documented, then when you have adverse experience and you approach organizations like National Fair Housing Alliance, that information is very vital for us to actually support our consumers in their experience, in their journey, right? And it's also important, the third point the third thing that I believe that consumers should be doing if they're not doing it already is to know their rights and have confidence in existing laws. Now, the industry may want consumers to think that because we don't have AI regulation, then existing laws do not apply. But as far as AI's use in housing is concerned, we have laws like the Fair Housing Act, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, we have the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, and all that laws that actually show that these information are protected characteristics like race, color, your religion, familial status, and other characteristics cannot be used and should not be used to make lending decision or housing decision. So if consumers are informed, if they ask the right question and they document their experience, then that information shows that, well, they really know their rights. And if the lenders that are using these AI systems in a discriminatory way don't change, at least then civil rights organizations can come in to actually assist them. And I also like to say, last thing that I think consumers need to be aware of is around transparency and also keeping some of the service providers accountable. So when you ask your question and they are not really forthcoming about how or where they're using the system, that's actually the time to call for transparency because if I go to the store now and I want to do grocery shopping, one of the things I do is I read through the label just to make sure that I'm not feeding myself some poison, right? The same thing should apply to consumers, right? So they need to advocate for transparency, knowing that these systems, in one way or the other, impact their lives, right? So it's really important for them to also be their own advocate and asking for transparency from the service providers.
Thank you so much. And I did say that that was my last question, but I have one more question just because I'm really enjoying this conversation.
Good.
And this one is more of a personal question, but I'm curious because as someone with a background and expertise in math and in algorithmic science, and as we're seeing algorithms be used like across all sectors and in so many aspects of our lives, I'm curious how you chose to focus on the housing sector specifically, and maybe housing isn't the first thing that someone thinks of when they think of AI being involved in their life. But yeah, I'm curious what drew you to the housing space specifically.
What drew me to housing? That's really a good question. There are moments where you say, well, you don't really know what you're getting into. You made a decision, but then you got into it and you actually realize that it's a good thing. It's good that you got into it. So you're right. My background is in math. And even though I studied math, I've always been thinking of applying math to social issues. Right from when I was in high school, I was more or less like a social critic, right? So like trying to have like conversations around social issues, how to address it and all that, right? Fast forward to when I did my undergrad and also my grad studies, right? So I've always been thinking about the consequences or the impact of math, right, on social issues, right? And again, more so I know that math is, a representation of what we're thinking, a representation of our assumptions and all that, right? But when I started, I actually started in homeowner insurance. So developing models for deciding, for example, your auto premium, what you pay on your homeowner insurance, and then auto insurance, right? And then, my consciousness around how AI could limit access to homeowner insurance, to auto insurance actually grew. Because I saw instances where, for example, women could be charged higher premium compared to men. And seniors could also be charged higher premium compared to younger ones. So I started paying attention to how the algorithm is actually leading to all these outcomes. And from there, from starting with insurance, I went on to work for a fintech and also even in banking, where we're thinking of how we can leverage alternative data to provide, to make sure that we're able to assess credit worthiness, right? And that was when, I got this opportunity about housing. And I know that housing is connected to a lot of infrastructure. In fact, at the National Fair Housing Alliance, we talk about how housing or where you live matters. Where you live matters in the sense that housing is connected to transportation, credit, health, education, and a lot of even your digital access, right? So that's what really drew me to housing, that if we are able as an organization to eliminate discriminatory use of of AI in housing, then that is going to have positive ripple effects in all these other areas that are connected to housing, right? So, for example, if we think about education, right? So, the other time I talked about automated valuation models. So, in the US, it's not surprising that there is a correlation, if not perfect correlation, between the value of your property or the average value of of properties in the neighborhood and the rating of the school in that neighborhood, right? So that means that if the problem of appraisal bias is effectively resolved, then that would also improve the rating of that school. So that was what drew me to housing.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed hearing about that career pathway that led you to where you are now. And it seems like, you're just the perfect person to be speaking with on this intersection.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time.